The project planning phase of any ERP project or digital transformation is one of the most important, if not the most important phases of the project. It's what determines whether or not your project is going to succeed or fail. And in particular, how you establish your RFP, your contracts, your statements of work, and all the governance around how you structure your project are more likely to determine success or failure than most other activities you might undertake in your digital transformation. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients through their digital transformations. And we're going to cover these topics in today's video. And I also have with me two renowned experts in the space, Marcus Harris and Daryl Crockett. Welcome to the video. And Marcus, maybe give us a quick introduction to who you are.
Yeah, thanks, Eric. As Eric said, my name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and intellectual property attorney. I work at a firm called Taft, and Hollister, and have extensive experience both drafting and negotiating ERP implementation related contracts and then litigating failed ERP implementations as well.
Great. Thanks for being here, Marcus. And Daryl?
Hello, my name is Daryl Crockett, and I'm the CEO of Validatum. We are a data migration and data integration firm. I like to say we work on complex data migrations and gnarly data integrations. So it's all about data and making that data ready for projects.
Great. Well, that's a few different perspectives that we'll talk about here today. And, you know, my background is more on the project governance, project management side. So I think if we look at those three angles of the planning stage, there's a lot to think about and a lot to unpack. So to start, I guess, you know, if we back up and just think about the mindset of the average company as they're going through a digital transformation, they're getting ready to start their transformation. They're excited. They've selected whatever software or technologies they think are going to be the best fit for their companies. And now it's time to move forward with contracts. And backing up even a little bit before then, you also have the RFP, which is really when a lot of the momentum gets baked, or the direction of the project gets baked. And so when you guys think about the whole process of defining an RFP and the contracts and the statements of work that go behind a transformation like this, what are some of the biggest challenges or pitfalls you see companies make? And Marcus, why don't we start with you?
Yeah, well, you know, I think one of the issues that I see on a pretty regular basis with my clients is that they don't really want to take advantage of the contract negotiation process or even the RFP process to really leverage that to their advantage. And for me, what it's really always about is two major components. It's about flexibility and it's about accountability. And you know, when you're drafting and negotiating these types of documents, you really want to think prospectively about all the different ways that you're going to be able to use that piece of functionality, that software, and make sure that you've got, you know, the foresight to put provisions in that contract to account for not only the way you're going to use that software today, but hopefully the way you're going to be able to use that software 5, 10, 15 years down the road. Because if you do that, you know, you're going to avoid unnecessary surprises with respect to cost, unnecessary allegations of breach of that contract. And then you want to think about accountability. And I think, you know, from a project management standpoint, there's no better time really to bake into these project management documents. And I'm thinking specifically of, you know, consulting agreements, MSAs, and SOWs, to put in very specific language that details, you know, project timelines, deliverables, milestones, and the like. And I think if you focus on really these two overarching concepts, flexibility and accountability, you're really setting yourself up for success, and you're starting to think with the right mindset from the beginning.
Yeah, it seems like a lot of organizations get so excited about the project in general that they have blinders on a little bit about, you know, how do you mitigate against the risk, and what do you do when things don't go well? At that point in the project, there's a lot of momentum, so it's hard for some organizations to think about that. Daryl, what about you? What are some of the things you're seeing or that you've seen in terms of pitfalls, things to watch out for?
Well, I think I tend to see that the company is focused on their own internal team and on their own internal plans, and that they have a just an assumption that the supplier is going to know what they're supposed to do, which is a good assumption, but I don't think it's always the way that you think it's going to work out. And they're so focused on what they're trying to do, they're just letting the vendor write in what they want. They don't want to deal with the contract. And that tends to lead to things getting missed, or language in there that benefits the supplier as opposed to benefiting the end customer. I think that you have to have a checklist, and I'm sure Marcus can help, and you can help as well to articulate, what are those points, what are the core points that we should be thinking about, and making sure that we get language in there. And we'll talk about a little bit more about that. But generally, don't get so wrapped up in what you're trying to do with your team and about the project itself, and forget about the fact that you have to write this legal document. And it is a task. It is as important as the charter. It's important as defining the scope, and it is a very logical step in the process that's going to lead to a lot of either problems or better governance going forward through the project.
Yeah, I agree with you. And speaking of governance, that's another thing that's important to think about as we look to our contracts and our SOWs. What are the roles and responsibilities of the system integrator, the vendor, if they have a role in this as well beyond providing software. Are there any services that they're providing, as well as internal resources too? You want to make sure you have clarity around who's doing what and what those assumptions are. And another sort of project governance type of thing that we see with things related to contracts and SOWs is just having a clear understanding and clear alignment on what this project's going to look like, just more strategically. Because a lot of times the vendor or the SI will come in and they've got kind of call it a cookie cutter, best practice, whatever you want to call it. It's what they've done for other clients that may or may not work for you. And so we want to make sure that, we account for things like the culture of the organization. Is it a, kind of a risk adverse, slow moving culture, or is it a really high paced, entrepreneurial culture? Those are two very different companies. They're going to have very different sets of assumptions and project plans and risks and costs and time commitments and all that stuff. So those are an example of things that we want to make sure we're aligned on. One being culture. Another one is just really making sure that executives have a clear vision and alignment for what the project's going to be. How much are we going to standardize operations, for example, versus, remaining decentralized? That will present two very different SOWs or contracts that you want to see. And a lot of times companies will have misalignment there. Their contracts and their SOWs say one thing and have one set of assumptions, but then over here, the executives expect something totally different. And it's hard to reconcile that midstream after you've already committed to budgets and contracts and all that good stuff. So Daryl, follow-up question then would be, when you're a data expert, your company focuses on data migration, data management. What are some of the things specifically related to data that companies should be aware of that you feel like most companies probably aren't aware of as they head into their contracts and their SOWs?
Sure. I think the biggest thing is the contracts that I see oftentimes barely even mention data. Like it's some sort of afterthought about the whole project, which is crazy in my mind, right? I like to see the data readiness as a track in the project plan, and certainly as its own home inside any RFPs or any type of contracts or statements of work, MSAs. I think that the preliminary understanding that needs to be clearly spelled out as early as possible is, what are the roles related to data? I'm seeing an interesting trend when I sit in meetings with new clients and they talk about their integrator, and their integrator is going to transform and load their data. And when I get right down to it and ask my questions and ask them to show me the tools and the templates that they're using, it becomes painfully clear that the system integrator isn't really changing your data from its form in its legacy system and making it perfect and ready to move into the new system, they're simply providing a template and maybe doing some very rudimentary one-to-one kind of swap outs of data. But it is clearly, by lack of anybody saying anything, the responsibility of the business to figure out how to clean their data and make it good enough to put it into the template that the system integrator will then load. So don't be fooled. You really want to get down to who is actually going to extract the data from our legacy systems. It's probably multiple systems, right? And who's actually going to change ABC to 1, 2, 3 and talk to Mary Sue and find out which customers she wants to migrate and which she doesn't, what fields are being kept and which fields can be left behind. All those details from the beginning have to be at the forefront, I believe, in the negotiations and contractual discussions.
Yeah, you bring up a great point about roles and responsibilities and making sure that those are defined in the contract. And most importantly, like you said, data is not even mentioned in a lot of these contracts, which by default would mean that the implementing company is going to be responsible. And a lot of times that's not the expectation. What about you, Marcus? From your perspective, what are some of the other, in addition to roles and responsibilities, what are some of the other angles or things that people should really be aware of and hone in on when they're negotiating a contract with their vendor SI?
Well, in addition to the things that I said earlier, or really kind of narrowing down on them, these concepts of flexibility and accountability. I mean, I think the goal of the contract negotiation process is really twofold. One, I think it's really an opportunity for you as a purchaser of technology services or software services to really have an opportunity to level set with that vendor and really just set your expectations. Because I think if you're not putting in the detail around what you think you're licensing, and it really has to come down to a very granular level. I mean, if you're just saying, hey, we're licensing SAP for it, or whatever the latest and greatest from SAP is, you can't use their nomenclature necessarily. I mean, you've got to actually say what it is. I mean, I'm negotiating a contract now that's got SAP freight spend. I have no idea what that is, and there's got to be clarity around that. And this goes back to this concept of flexibility and accountability, because if you define it with specificity, then you've got an understanding of where your cost is going to be over the life cycle of that product, and you're going to be able to hold them accountable to be able to deliver what they say they're going to deliver. So, it kind of falls back on itself to some extent, but the goal at the end of that contract negotiation process, once you've level set with them, is to have in your hand a document that you can put in your desk drawer, and when something goes awry, something goes sideways, you can pull that document out, you can sit back and look at it, and you can say, look, vendor, here's exactly what you're supposed to do. Here's the process that is detailed when this happens. So, I mean, that's the level of clarity that you want to put into these documents so that it actually functions as a tool to ensure that at the end of the day, you've got a successful implementation, a successful relationship with that vendor.
Yeah, that's a good point. And speaking of a relationship with the vendor, how do you bring people together? The multiple parties together during the negotiation process. You've got the implementing company, you've got the vendor, you've got the system integrator. There might be other parties as well. How does that all work typically?
Well, I think first and foremost, you've got to look at the contract negotiation process as a collaborative process, because really what you're doing is, you're working your way through sets of issues and sets of problems so that you can reach compromise and that everybody has an understanding of what their role is during that implementation. And I think the more on the same page that everybody is, the better off you're certainly going to be. I think a lot of clients really focus on this as more of an adversarial process, which I don't think serves anybody very well. And I think most clients that I deal with, at least initially, they're way more concerned about pricing and discounts off of list price that they're going to get from a vendor or from a system integrator. What kind of discount are you going to give us? And they're really not focused on some of these more critical project management aspects which really, to me, I mean, if you're not focusing on those, the 40% discount you got off the list really isn't going to matter very much, because if the project goes sideways, there's going to be unexpected costs and unexpected issues that weren't accounted for. I think once things have gone sideways, as far as bringing people together, I think it's critical that you have some sort of a dispute resolution mechanism put into the contract, so that there's certain levels of resolution that both parties need to go through in order to address that issue. Because what you don't want to do is necessarily be silent on that issue and then go straight to litigation, because nobody wins when that happens.
Right. Yeah, it's a great point. And certainly the whole idea here is how do we avoid litigation, even though we all hope and expect we're not going to need to ever pull that contract out of the desk drawer, like you said, but we have to plan as though we may, and make sure all that is built into the contract.
Well, exactly. And I think that's the critical mindset to have when you're going into this, is that this, if you have an expectation, and it sounds horrible because you don't want to go into it with a defeatist attitude, but if you go into this process with the mindset that there's a very high chance that this thing can fail, what do I do now with these contractual documents to account for that and to ensure that it doesn't happen? And I think that's really the mindset that you want to have when you're negotiating contracts.
Yeah. Yeah, and on the project governance side too, it's all about risk mitigation. How do you put those guardrails in place so that when the project does start to veer out of its lane or off the track or whatever, how do you make sure you've got those guardrails in place? And that whole project governance is extremely important. And we have to have a vision for what we want our project governance and our project management strategy to be before we do the contracts, ideally, because then we can have the appropriate assumptions and have a clear idea of what it is we want out of the project. I'd be curious to see what you think of this, Marcus, but a lot of times it seems like companies are almost early in the project, because they don't have a lot of experience with ERP projects. They want to over-depend, or they become over-dependent on the system integrator and the vendor to tell them how the project should be. And it seems like the relationship early on gets a little bit out of balance, where they have, the SIs or the vendors have more influence on what the contract looks like, and the implementing company doesn't have enough knowledge to have the leverage to know what to ask, or to know what they're really getting themselves into. Would you agree with that, or have you seen that in your career?
No, I think that's par for the course. And I think every, look, these vendors and system integrators, they've got form contract templates that they push on their customers, where every word, every sentence, every comma in that document really is slanted towards the benefit of the vendor or the SI. And it's incredibly difficult to get out of that box. You've got to have experienced counsel. You've got to have experienced experts on your side that have done this before, that can just kind of beat that back. Because if you don't, and you're just relying on the vendor or the SI, I mean, you've got a problem at that point. I mean, you've got to really take control of this and come at it from a perspective that, look, this is my implementation, this is my contract negotiation, and make it about you as much as you can. I mean, you can't. I always tell my clients, and some of them come to me and say, well, just take their contract, redline it and make this into an ironclad contract for us. And that's all well and good, but the problem with that is there's got to be some give, because I can do that, but no one's going to sign an ironclad contract. I mean, not sophisticated business people. So you've got to watch out. There's got to be give and take on both sides, and you've got to have, at the end of the day, a contract that doesn't shift all the business risks associated with that project to you. The vendor and the SI have to bear some of that risk, and if you can do that, then you've done a pretty good job.
Yeah.
I wanted to bring something up, Eric. I love what you say about Marcus, about the legal oversight. Clearly, I see too often they have people helping in legal teams that are assisting in the negotiation and that know nothing about ERP systems, and this is not helping anybody. You really need to make sure that you're talking with an attorney, working with an attorney that is experienced in this area. The second thing that I was thinking of when you were talking is that there is a reliance on the system integrator, but we have to make sure that we've got our eye on the system integrator as well. So project management, independent project management, even if it's not full-time, even if it's just someone that's assisting periodically, that is attending meetings, that can give you, the customer, the feedback from an independent and a very experienced, hey, what they're saying doesn't really make a lot of sense, or hey, I've seen this before, and if you go down this road, or you don't do this now, and let them do that, or do what they're advising, I think you're going to run into problems. So I think certainly project oversight, legal oversight, and I think the same thing holds true for data. I often see if they do get the system integrator to do the data, they don't have real data people doing that. They have the people who are also configuring the system doing the data, which means that without an independent, at least data oversight periodically to make sure everybody's doing their job, and make sure that if a person is doing dual roles, that there's some sort of process governance to that, and ways to have metrics to check in on how people are doing. But what can happen is when you allow your system integrator to do the data work itself for the conversion, one, they usually don't do it terribly well because they're configurers, not data people. And two, they can always blame their lack of preparedness or readiness with the technology on the data. And if you let them do two roles, you have a hard time pulling everything apart, and you end up sometimes with a lag in the project because it's really the system and the data that need to work together. But if you allow the configurer to blame it always on the data readiness and the messiness of the data, you kind of slow things down.
Yeah, right. No, I agree. I think something that you brought up, Eric, I think is incredibly important is that, and you've touched on it too, Daryl, is having a project management plan. And, from my perspective as a lawyer in this area, it's absolutely critical. But what ends up happening, and I think this is probably at the direction or the influence of maybe the vendor or the SI, is that gets put in a project plan. And I think that's fine. But what you don't want to do is put all the detail in a project plan and not also include it to some extent as an exhibit to the statement of work or the MSA or some kind of contractually binding document, because if you can't necessarily enforce a project plan in court, but you certainly can enforce a contract. And I think it's important to have the foresight to say, hey, those are good details. Let's make it contractually binding so that you actually have an obligation to do those things to us contractually.
Yeah.
Super. That's such a good point. I have to interrupt. If somebody even just worked with you, Eric, to put together what is a typical, very detailed project plan that we know is at least 1,000 lines long, look at that of a similar size project first as you're going through and building these documents, these contracts. That would certainly show where you need room for this, a mention on that, who's going to do this. Projects of this size and magnitude with so much financial impact on a company, I don't think people really realize all the steps that are involved. And if they had known that at the beginning, they might have said, hey, I think we need another test cycle. And maybe you want to leave a little more time between your build cycles in order to have time to clear some of the defects that are obviously come back. And how do we insert our data testing in there, our validation in there? How many mock data loads do we need? And isn't that a little bit too close for the first time you're loading data to your functional user testing? Those kinds of things, by looking and starting the process with at least a template of a really good project plan, would allow the conversation, I think, to flow a little bit better.
Yeah, I agree. And it's also, you think about companies that the diligence they put into doing any other capital investment, like acquiring a company. And granted, we're not acquiring a company here with an ERP implementation, but it kind of is like acquiring, as far as the risk in the capital, it's like acquiring a small company or building a new facility. You think about all the due diligence companies do to do those types of things, and all the governance controls and the plans they have to manage that. But then they get to an ERP project and they think, well, this is just an IT project. We've got a system integrator that's going to come in and do it for us. And they don't understand, like you guys said, they don't understand what the implications are. So having that plan up front, along with the risk management, the risk the risk mitigation and the governance in place is extremely important. It all starts really back at the RFP process. I mean, we were going through the selection, and you have the RFP that goes out. You're evaluating products. You're making sure you're buying what you were shown. I mean, that's kind of red flag number one that you often see even before you see the contracts. You want to make sure that you know what's happening during the selection process, and that aligns with the contracts as well. So a lot of different things to be aware of for sure. So Daryl, what are some of the things that you've seen as far as success metrics and working that into the contracts? What has your experience been?
On the initial data load, we're expecting to see this. On the second one, we're expecting to see that. It kind of protects both parties, because a lot of times people think they have to load 100% of their data 100% accurately. It's just never going to happen. It's just never going to happen. So being able to say what's a realistic expectation for these things, for timelines, and for a number of records, and the quality of those records is really important.
I think that is really important, and it's not something that we do with that level of granularity on the front end, because we're, from a contractual standpoint, if you're just talking about terms and conditions, what you're talking about are really warranties and representations and remedies for any breach of those warranties. So you're going to have essentially a performance warranty, okay, for the service, and I'm talking about consulting services, or you're going to have an SLA for a cloud product. And you're going to have some definition as to what the uptime should be, and that the services are going to be provided in accordance with generally accepted standards. So you don't really have that, but I think it's critically important to try to come up with some clarity around that from a legal perspective, because we've got an issue with a large vendor now, and the software, its processing times are anywhere between 7 to 20 seconds. And the vendor can't fix it. They can't get it to under 4 seconds. So had that been put into the contract, you'd have a much better case. So it's good that you're doing those kinds of things.
Yeah, I think anytime we can come up with some metric that's really important to the success of the project. In other words, I can't call this project a success unless you do A, B, and C, especially if you're tying this to some sort of ROI.
Right.
Hopefully you are. You can carve any of those out and put that in the contract, or at least refer to another document to be created with mutual satisfaction of all parties, and call that document out within the contract so that you guys know you have to have a document, a subsequent project document that you all have to agree on. And that's a significant milestone. I think that's fine too.
All right. Well, thanks for that. That's good stuff. So the three of us, Marcus and Daryl and I, all work together on various clients, and we've worked together and crossed paths in many different capacities. We also are speaking at the STRATOSPHERE conference in 2020. So that's part of why we're together on this video. But for those of us, or those of the viewers that don't know all three of us, I thought we'd maybe talk a little bit about each of our companies in a little bit more detail. Daryl, why don't you start by talking a little bit about Validatum and what your team does?
Sure. We really specialize on helping companies with their data readiness track of their ERP projects, and also with the integration that falls after that, or maybe, that's the project itself. Helping them to plan out that data readiness track on their project plans, assisting them with any language that might have to go into some of the contracts, working with them either just to select tools, select vendors, define roles, project oversight, or actually coming in and offering the use of some of our tools for data migration, data cleansing, as well as providing, if you need augmentation, staff augmentation to handle the whole soup to nuts data migration side.
And then Marcus, what about Taft Law? Tell us about what you and your team do at Taft.
Yeah, Taft is essentially kind of a mid-sized law firm. We're about almost 600 attorneys, which is actually a great size, because we've got the flexibility with rates, but we also have the sophistication with practice areas, and we've got really deep subject matter bench here. We've got about 65 attorneys in the technology and intellectual property practice group. So we can throw resources at these types of legal matters. And again, we've got just a variety of different types of expertise that we can call on, whether we're dealing with a particular type of breach of contract issue or some specific technology issue. Me personally, I've got almost 20 years of experience in this very specific area, and I've worked at a couple of the largest software companies in-house, drafting and negotiating contracts on their behalf. And so I think one of the values that I can bring to the table for clients is really having an understanding of software vendor tactics, and what it takes to negotiate with them, what they're going to give on, what they're not going to give on, and then really, to the extent you've got to litigate, really having an understanding of what it takes to be successful in that kind of scenario, and hopefully drive those cases to settlement so that they don't get out of hand expense-wise.
Yep. Yeah, and some interesting history about the three of us too. Marcus, you and I go way back as far as having done some expert witness work together. I've been an expert witness for you, and now Taft Law is third stage as a corporate attorney. And now whenever we have a client who needs help on the legal side negotiating contracts, you're the guy we refer him to. And then Daryl on the validatum side, in addition to having obviously your practice, we also use you as our data arm. Anytime a client has a need in data that gets me personally, I'm way over my head pretty quickly when it comes to data, which is where you come in. So that's a way that the three of us work together. And third stage is a independent consulting firm. We help clients with software selection. We help them define the digital strategy and their roadmap. And we also help them with the implementation readiness, and then ultimately the project management and the PMO, project governance, quality assurance side of it as well. We also do quite a bit in the way of organizational change management, beginning early in the stages of planning. We didn't really have time to talk about that here today, but that's another area that's important to start early, and that's another service area that we focus on as a company. But I want to thank you guys both for being here today in this video. I've included some links and contact information in the description below, so those of you watching know how to get a hold of all three of us, actually. So thanks again, Marcus and Daryl. Appreciate having you here today.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good to see you guys.
All right. Thank you, guys. We'll talk soon.